Welcome to Firstline, I'm Daniel Pizarro. South-East Queensland and northern New South Wales is being battered by Cyclone Alfred. The Category 2 system has been meandering slowly off the course for several days, but now its effects are being clearly felt. Power is out to tens of thousands of homes, huge swells are being reported on our coastlines, and torrential rain, damaging winds and severe flooding is predicted from Queensland south through the Northern Tablelands. Joining me live from the Bureau of Meteorology is meteorologist Jordan Notara. Jordan, thank you very much for joining me. We know the past couple of days have been intense given that Cyclone Alfred has been very erratic and slow and being very bizarre for many people. Currently, how is the cyclone tracking?
Yeah, so that continued slow movement has seen significant rainfall accumulations over the last 3 days across northeastern New South Wales. Upwards of half a metre of rain already observed around parts of the Dorrigo Plateau, and still hundreds or so millimetres around parts of northeastern New South Wales. The forecast is for this system, for the tropical cyclone to breach land as we head into Saturday morning, and that heavy rainfall is going to continue across northeastern New South Wales, particularly through the overnight period into tomorrow morning. And that heavy rainfall is the one we're looking out for the potential we could see some quite sharp river rises across broad areas of northeastern New South Wales.
Because we know the southern flank of the cyclone is the most dangerous, and that's where northern New South Wales is. So that area around Lismore, the borders, as well as extending slightly inland, then heading southward, that's going to be the area where it's going to cop the most, isn't it?
Yeah, significantly broad areas of potential moderate to major flooding, as well as some lower level flooding further south as well. At this stage, we have already seen flood warnings already issued for areas around the Tweed, the Richmond, and even other areas around the northeast, with a flood watch covering quite broad areas of the New England northwest, including parts of the Guida, the Peel, the Namoy, and that's for that flooding that's on the way as we head across in the later part of the weekend as the system weakens and tracks over broader parts of the inland parts of New South Wales. So while in the short term, we are going to see that focus of rain over those more coastal parts and the coastal ranges, by the time we head towards Sunday, we are going to start to see that heavy rainfall possibly falling over parts of Tamworth, and we could see 40 to 50 millimetres falling over a 24-hour period, leading to that potential risk of river rises in those areas.
And how are we looking for some of the communities that are further in the tablelands? I know Ebor could be absolutely smashed by, they're predicting like several hundred millimetres of rain by Sunday. We're also having some reports of possible damaging winds in other parts of the northwest. Is that true?
Yeah, the risk is going to shift from the cyclogenic kind of winds we'd see around a tropical cyclone to more ones associated with severe thunderstorms by the time we move towards that later part of the weekend. So still going to be focusing upon those broad chances of seeing severe thunderstorms that could produce heavy to possibly even intense rainfall and quite strong damaging winds that could form. So while we may see those tropical cyclone warnings ease and potentially be cancelled, the focus will be one to shift back towards the products that we'll be more likely seeing in New South Wales, which has severe weather warnings and severe thunderstorm warning products. And that's going to be ones that are going to be issued as storms form, and also will be covering some areas that may not have already been affected by these tropical cyclone warnings.
We know that there has been flood evacuations already. We have a lot of houses without power. There's been some reported damage at the moment. When is the most dangerous period at the moment that the BOM is looking at? When is the place that people should not be on the roads? They should be taking shelter. They should have evacuated when asked. Do you know what time that would be?
Well, as we're moving into the next 24 hours, I think we're looking at the riskiest period, particularly obviously as we see the system start to track close towards the land. So as the system moves closer, the winds are going to be on the increasing trend, and we are going to again see the high tide tomorrow morning be a possible period where we could see some areas of low lying around the coast be inundated by those higher tides as well. The focus will be one that shifts away from, I guess, the stronger winds by the time we head towards the later part of tomorrow. Those winds are going to be on an easing trend as we get to the later part of Saturday, but the rain is going to continue to fall, and the potential is that we can see some heavier pockets of quite intense rainfall falling in those areas that we have got flood warnings current, and the potential is there that we could see some quite sharp river rises as well.
And as you mentioned, this can take a couple of days for these floodwaters to actually come down some of the catchment areas. People might think, oh, we're not going to have much rain or we don't see any or a bit of wind. But then these floodwaters, especially if it comes to flash flooding, they can inundate areas within a matter of minutes and people can be caught completely off guard.
Yeah, each catchment is very unique and it really just focuses back to what we need to check on, which is obviously the messaging from our emergency services or exactly what we should do in each location. For an example, obviously we've seen already half a metre of rain falling over areas near Dorrigo, but those floodwater peaks are still expected to be in a couple of days' time further downstream. So even obviously we've seen that rainfall in our gauges, it still takes time for that water to come downstream. And that's obviously going to be a factor of how quickly that rain falls and how widespread it is across those catchments that are expecting rain over the next couple of days.
Mr. Notaro, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And to get the latest on the ground, I spoke to David Rankin from the New South Wales SES's Tamworth headquarters a short time ago as thousands of workers prepare for Cyclone Alfred. David, thank you so much for joining Firstline. We really appreciate your time, especially given what has been happening up in the far north of New South Wales and South-East Queensland. First, what are the major areas of concern from tonight through the weekend?
Look, certainly here in the State Emergency Service, we're based in Tamworth, and I look after the northwestern zone area of Tamworth, which includes the New England and the Western Slopes and Plains. From an organisational perspective, our focus really is still on the northeastern zone, which is the Northern Rivers through to the mid-north coast and even down to lower parts around the Port Macquarie area. There is an enormous amount of rain. We've seen falls of up to 500 and 600 millimetres already in some areas of the Northern Rivers. And the SES has now worked in conjunction with WellFact to establish 19 or 20 evacuation centres right across those communities. And there are a significant number of evacuation orders for communities right across the Northern Rivers area, some of which came into effect at 9 p.m. last night and others have been rolling out this morning to ensure that the community is well prepared for the rainfall that's coming. And as this tropical cyclone hits the coast in and around the Sunshine Coast of Brisbane area over the course of the next 24 hours, and then becomes a tropical low and moves its way inland right across southern Queensland and northern parts of northern New South Wales.
Now, we have seen already thousands of homes in those areas without power, as well as a bit of damage already, and the cyclone hasn't even struck coast at the moment. Do we have any figures about how many homes have been affected at the moment?
We don't really have an accurate figure yet. A lot of our volunteers are out actually responding to the thousands of requests for assistance that our volunteers have received from the community. A lot of that damage assessment will be conducted once the worst of the damage has actually come through. Our focus at the moment, obviously, as an organisation, is to ensure that the residents are well prepared. The residents that require evacuation are getting that evacuation alert early enough, and that if people are isolated, that we're able to provide some support for them, either through assistance with evacuation centres, and also there are assistance with properties that may have already received some damage from fallen trees, and there's a lot of power out. So we are suggesting to people, if they do think that they are in a bad situation in terms of potentially being isolated or requiring evacuation, to heed the call of our volunteers in the New South Wales SES. If you can't find family and friends to go and stay with, there are a number of evacuation centres available right across the Northern Rivers, and that list is on the SES website at ses.nsw.gov.au. And there are people there to assist you in finding emergency accommodation, food, and all the clothing and shelter that you may require as this tropical cyclone continues to move inland.
Now, we have, of course, gotten several flood warnings for parts of the Northern Tablelands at the moment. I know there's areas particularly around places like Georges Creek. Ebor's supposed to get an absolute drenching over the next few days. We also have some isolated Aboriginal communities in the New England National Park that have also been issued with an isolation warning. What's the latest on those?
Yeah, there are a number of isolations and potential evacuation warnings happening right across the Northern Rivers and into the Tablelands, as I said. At the moment, there is just a flood watch being issued for the Northern Tablelands, but there is a watch and act for people from Coffs Harbour and inland through Glen Innes, Deepwater and even up to Tenterfield to stay indoors and stay out of the weather. That Watch and Active was issued earlier today, and it is an advice for people to make sure that they are safe. They're not going out into the winds. The issue we're seeing on the coast is that these extremely strong winds are bringing down trees and power lines, and we don't want people to be in unsafe situations in their community. We want them to stay indoors where it's safe, get out of the very dangerous wind conditions that we're expecting on the tablelands and slopes and plains in the next couple of days, and obviously the conditions that are being experienced right now on the coast. It is a very unsafe situation. So the Watch and Act has been established to make sure that people heed that warning, stay indoors where it's practical. And I know even to the point on the northern rivers now, and certainly southeastern Queensland, large numbers of schools have also been closed to keep kids at home, keep them safe, make sure that parents aren't on the road at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. to collect kids, and also make sure kids aren't in buses and travel. They're home safe where they're meant to be during this flooding. We'll continue to watch that over the next few days, and I can imagine that maybe some of those decisions, if things escalate over the next few days on the Northern Tablelands and in southern Queensland, as it moves west, that some of those things may also be implemented. It's too early to say yet because we haven't seen the rainfall on the Tablelands, but we're certainly as an organisation keeping a very close eye on the conditions and listening very closely to the Bureau of Meteorology about the expected rainfall and wind conditions over the next few days.
And we know that this afternoon the SES has also issued a flood warning for the Namoy and Peel rivers. So are you monitoring places outside the main areas concerned, such as Tamworth and Gunnedah?
Yeah, certainly. We've been looking at communities like Ashford, Yetman, Inverell, Tamworth, Gunnedah, Narrabri, and even along the Guida River catchment. Communities like Gravesend, Pallamallawar and Moree are all on our radar. As this tropical cyclone makes landfall tomorrow and continues westward and becomes a tropical depression low, there is the expectation that anywhere from 150 to 300 mils of rain could fall in that 24-hour period over Sunday and into Monday. Now, that's obviously, that'll be isolated falls. There is a general expectation that anywhere between 80 and 120 mils will fall right across the inland parts of New South Wales. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. But what we are saying is that there is any risk of minor to anywhere up to major flooding in some of the catchments on the inland. If you do want to have a clear understanding of what those warnings are, you can go to hazardwatch.org.au or download the Hazards Near Me app, and all of those warnings are readily available on hand and in real time for the community to get a clear understanding of what's happening in your area. But we'll certainly be keeping a very close eye on any escalating situations. As I said, I've just come out of a weather briefing from the Bureau of Meteorology. They've given us the latest updates on some of those communities. And as I said, there is an expectation that under certain thunderstorm conditions, there may be falls of up to 300 mils in isolated areas across the northwest. That's very dry. We expect that up to 100 mils of that may be lost just in ground absorption and into dams and those sorts of things. But still, if it comes in very heavy periods, there is a chance of flash flooding across many of the areas in the next few days.
We'll certainly be keeping an eye on that. And finally, Mr. Rankine, I know that over the past couple of days that there has been some concern among authorities that people might not be taking Cyclone Alfred seriously. We've had some, lighthearted Facebook groups like blow at Cyclone Alfred to make it go away, but other people have been a bit more serious and are not taking this cyclone threat as seriously. What do you have to say to people saying, "Oh, this is not going to affect us"?
I'll probably look back to my own personal experience in 2022 with the Lismore flooding. I was part of the SES flood response there, and when 800 mils of rain fell in a 12-hour period on the upward catchments of the Wilsons River, due to very heavy storms dropping enormous amounts of rain in very short periods of time, we saw very clearly the impacts of that heavy rainfall can have on quite large communities like Lismore, and unfortunately that was repeated again a month later in March. What I will say to people is that strong wind on its own can have some significant impacts in communities in terms of trees coming down on houses. We've seen deaths in recent storms in Sydney where trees have come down on cars as people are transiting through the community. Live power lines can have significant impacts. Well, personally, I've loved getting on Facebook and watching a lot of the surfing footage from some of our amazing surfers on the coast, as the storm has been a long way off and brought great swell, and some very talented people have taken advantage of that. But as we've seen this cyclone come closer, there's been a lot of near misses with people standing by the on breakwaters and things, almost getting washed away by waves. And as that intensity comes closer, we're going to ask people to take this thing very seriously. It is a very serious weather event. It's been a very long time since cyclones made its way this far south. The last decent cyclone we saw was Debbie in 2017 or 18. That was right in the north of Queensland, but the destruction came all the way down into New South Wales with heavy rainfall and quite significant damage. So this is not something to be taken lightly. The SES in Northwestern Zone as an organisation will certainly not be taking this lightly, and we've got teams right across the area ready to respond. And we just ask people to make very sensible decisions. This is not the time to be outside. This is not the time to be driving through floodwater if you come across it. And it's certainly not the time to be making some foolish decisions around yours and your family's safety when you're out in the community.
Dave Rankine, thank you so much for your time.
Daniel, you're most welcome. Thanks for having me.
To other news now, and youth crime in the New England Northwest has continued to make headlines, with a push from the state opposition to toughen bail laws for repeat bail offenders. One of the worst affected communities is Moree, which is where three 14-year-olds allegedly stole a car last month and later collided with Narrabri man Daniel McNamara in Gunnedah, who was on his motorbike. He died soon afterwards. The teenagers didn't stop and were eventually arrested east of Gunnedah. Earlier this week, I spoke to Moree-based member for Northern Tablelands, Brendan Moylan, who agrees there is something seriously wrong in northwest New South Wales. Mr. Moylan, we know to say that the New England Northwest has been dealing with a crime wave is an understatement. In some cases, it's been more like a tsunami. And I guess one of the worst things about this is that the worst of the worst has happened. We've had a person being killed that we spoke about for last couple of weeks. Daniel McNamara from Narrabri being killed in Gunnedah by a allegedly stolen car driven by three 14-year-olds in Moree. When a person dies, we know that, okay, this should have been stopped a long, long time ago, and now we have the worst consequences possible. And we are still dealing with that tragedy of that death because we knew how shocking and how, in many ways, how disgusting the actions of those alleged teenagers were in the hours before the crash, but also afterwards, especially as police have said they didn't render assistance to Daniel. They continued to drive off. There is something seriously wrong, isn't there, in our region when it comes to youth crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the poor McNamara family have been through hell. That's a phone call that no father, brother should ever have to take. What happened? I mean, obviously that matters before the courts, so we have to be careful with what we say. But that you're right. Disgusting is probably one word, and quite a correct word to use to describe that incident. I think initially, Daniel, my initial feeling was one of shock and disbelief, and then it sort of gives way to a feeling of anger that it's gotten this far. When you look at what's going on, particularly in my hometown of Moree, but not just Moree, in Tamworth as well, and Inverell, Armidale, Kempsey, Grafton, right across regional New South Wales, it's pretty clear that there's something terribly wrong. And look, the Parliament has a number of jobs here. Number one, the Parliament has to look to legislate to ensure that regional communities are protected, and then the Parliament also has to look at the underlying issues of crime. And a lot of taxpayers' money is spent every year in communities in the New England Northwest to address the underlying issues of youth crime. And I think as a community and as taxpayers, we need to know whether that money is being spent well and what return taxpayers are getting. I think there needs to be more accountability for the money that is being spent in this space. And the question also has to be asked, are we targeting the right age group? Should we be targeting kids of a younger age group? Because certainly what I'm hearing when I talk to police, when I talk to teachers, youth workers, is that those programs that are funded by the state government perhaps need to be targeting younger children, 10, 11, 12, not children who are 14, 15, 16. So I think there's two roles for Parliament to play in that space. And then the third space is obviously to do whatever it can in terms of police resources, which is a big one as well.
And I was looking at the ideas, as you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, regarding trying to target younger people, maybe even younger than under 10 and all that. And for me, the biggest question is, when is the best at a younger age to reach out to the kids? Because, as you know, I've been interested to see about that cognitive development among kids and what they witness, what they understand, how they would learn from their surroundings, from family, from relatives, from other adults. And I think one of the biggest aspects too is to reach out in a way that does connect with them, but is also an effective way that makes it that this will have not just that short-term improvement or implications, but that long-term implications. Because I know some of these kids, they follow like their older siblings or other relatives because they think it's cool or that's the only life they know. So that's something that I would like to see the state government and the state opposition be able to really work on. Can you see where I'm coming with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you're 100% right from what I'm hearing across certainly my electorate, that quite often these young people who are committing these crimes are coming from a background where crime is the norm, and waking up in the morning and having a family unit and having a family figure that you can look up to is not the norm. And so there has to be accountability. I think the starting place needs to be is that the government has to look at and ask some pretty difficult questions. Say, right, what are we funding? What's this money achieving, and what sort of results are we getting? And then the next step is to say what could be done better. And I think that comes into that area that you're talking about there, Daniel, and looking at particularly these younger kids, because I'm really concerned that all of this money that we're spending at the moment is perhaps going to children, and they are children who are not going to be able to be helped by these programs purely because of their age. So, yeah, look, there's a lot of work to be done. It's such a difficult space. And look, the Premier, when he was in Moree a few weeks ago, he said something that sort of resonated with me, and I agree with the Premier on this. He said that if there was a simple fix, it would have been done years ago. And he's right. This is a incredibly complicated space. My view is that the first step of Parliament has to look at is legislative change to make sure the community is protected. And then the next step is some accountability in this funding and working out whether we're getting bang for buck in terms of the funding.
And you have just mentioned the push to change the bail laws. We have this petition that has reached over 20,000 signatures, and that will be presented to state parliament. We know that yourself and your fellow nationals, MLA Kevin Anderson, are backing this. And we also know that the state government is flagging the tougher bail laws at the moment. Looking at what the Premier Chris Minns is currently proposing, are you satisfied with what the state government is proposing, or do you think that there needs to be more done?
I certainly think more could be done. I mean, firstly, in relation to the Bail Act, the particular section that you're referring to is Section 22C. And the intention of the Parliament there was that in circumstances where a young person who is on bail for a serious offence, so that could be break and enter, motor vehicle theft, etc., if that young person is then released on bail and commits another serious offence, such as another break and enter or another motor vehicle theft, then bail should not be granted unless the court has a higher degree of certainty that the young person won't reoffend. So I don't think many people in the community would argue that someone who is already on bail for breaking into a house and then breaks into another house whilst on bail. I don't think many of the people in the community would expect that young person to get bail again. And certainly the victims of those B&Es wouldn't expect that. So I think credit where credit's due, that section is a good section. It has come under criticism both from the courts and from some sections of the parliament. But the extension of 22C, personally, is welcome. I would like to see the loophole in section 22C closed off so that courts simply cannot grant bail, whether they have a high degree of certainty or not, because we saw, and again, we need to be careful about what we say about the Gunnedah incident, but we saw what happens there in circumstances where the court exercises its discretion. And so I think ultimately 22C, if it could be amended to remove that discretion so that it's simple, so that if a young person breaks into a house and he's granted bail, he's given an opportunity and then breaks into another house, there shouldn't be bail in those circumstances. So I think 22C is a good starting point. I think we also need to look at the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act. I think the importance of victims in the sentencing synthesis, as it's known by judges, needs to be elevated. Getting a little bit technical, but putting my solicitor's hat on, I would like to see that the aggravating factors only need to be proven on the balance of probabilities, which is the same for the mitigating factors. Currently, the court has to find the aggravating factors proven beyond reasonable doubt, which limits the court's ability to make findings of aggravation, which would lengthen the sentence. And then similarly, I think the court also needs to look at Dolly Incapax. Dolly Incapax is a very old legal principle. It goes back, 400 or 500 years, but in circumstances where you have a young person who might be 13, covering their face, arming themselves, breaking into a house, being caught by the police and then charged, and then having no action taken because the young person is not 14 or over, and so it's assumed that the young person doesn't know what he or she is doing is wrong. Again, I just think that's not keeping up to date with Australia in 2025, and I think the Parliament should be looking at that legal principle as well.
As you have just mentioned about keeping repeat bail offenders in custody, that of course means that they're taken off the streets, and that can prevent them from committing further actions or be involved in any further actions. The question that I just want to put to you is, because of that, do you believe that New South Wales has the custody capacity at the moment to possibly have more of these juvenile offenders in detention awaiting their other court dates or anything like that? Because one issue I am very aware of currently going on in the Northern Territory is, while the Country Liberal Party has been doing this tough on crime bent since they were elected, with so many more people being arrested, their jails are so full that they've actually had to put people into watch houses, and they're facing a massive capacity issue. Are you happy with, or are you aware of what the current capacity is? Because the last thing we know that can also lead to more controversy is kids being put into police watchtowers or jail cells for sometimes long periods.
Yeah, so Section 22C only captures a very small number of offenders. It only captures, those serious repeat offenders, the worst of the worst. And so 22C is not a situation that is going to see hundreds and hundreds of children refused bail and locked up. I think the statistics during the trial of the last 12 months was that section only captured approximately 80, offenders in a 12-month period. And so it is a measure that the government have brought in that I support, which targets the worst of the worst. And so Section 22C should not, Daniel, lead to overcrowding, because it only targets a very small number of young offenders who are the worst of the worst.
That's good to know. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Moylan. You were, of course, up on Saturday. There were over 500 people gathering in Moree at Jellicoe Park, demanding an end to the crime situation. That's a significant minority of the Moree population saying enough is enough, and we know how bad the situation is up in that town, with so many break-ins or police pursuits that having to be conducted, which of course brings a lot of risk, not just to the police themselves, but to anyone that they're potentially chasing or any civilians that might be caught up with that. How was that meeting? What was the mood at that time?
It was pretty somber, to be honest. So, look, there was roughly, I think, 500 people there from the community. There were a number of victims of crime that spoke. A number of local Indigenous elders spoke. The brothers and dad of Mr. McNamara, who was killed at Gunnedah, they were also there and spoke. So it was a pretty somber mood. And I think it's on a Saturday morning where people have commitments, people have kids' sport, people have their shopping, people have work as well. The fact that 500 members of the community came together and listened and discussed this issue peacefully is a pretty good indication that the community, really wants a change. And like me, a lot of people in our community, particularly at Moree, are really getting frustrated with this is what we're now known for. Moree is now known as a crime capital, and we have such a good town here. We contribute so much to the Australian economy. We're the wealthiest agricultural shire in all of our country. We have great people, we have good facilities, and it is a great community. But unfortunately, because of a few bad eggs, we now have that reputation. So it was a somber mood and pretty strong desire for something to change as well.
And we know, given the fact that there is this push to get more people out into regional areas, but there's a lot of investment going on in Moree, ranging from renewables to the activation precincts, the inland rail, the tourism aspect as well. And many people are put off by coming to a place like Moree because they're in fear of being mugged or attacked or their house broken in. And we know, of course, one of the biggest issues is trying to get those critical welfare and doctors and all those specialists that are vital, that could really help the community of Moree, not just with the people themselves, but also those school kids, like those teachers, those social workers, those counsellors, those psychologists, and as well as those police officers who might be more reluctant to come up to a place like Moree, but we know that if they do come up, they could make a real big difference.
Yeah, you're right. It is really frustrating, and it's making, that reputation is making it difficult for private businesses to recruit. It's making it difficult for public organisations to recruit. For example, we had one of our doctors at the Aboriginal Medical Centre. He was broken into and assaulted. And so it makes it very difficult to attract those professional staff. So, look, it is a problem. Crime has been a problem, since Adam was a boy. That's the reality of it. And we will never stop crime. But what we have seen over, I think, the last 12 months, particularly in my hometown of Moree, is we've seen it spike. And the community is sending a really strong message to the Parliament that we need to change.
And without resorting to stereotypes, we know many of these crimes are being committed by those of Indigenous background, and that in itself often reveals the situation about what these kids' upbringing is being like. We've of course spoken about that these places that they're living in might not be the most advantageous. They might be witnessing domestic abuse, poverty. Or witnessing their family or friends doing the same thing, so they don't know any better. Looking at that, is there a different way that could be approached for Indigenous kids, or should it be a more wider scope for kids of all that ages? Because we know that in many ways there's always a different approach when it comes to Indigenous Australians and trying to combat the crime, but also break the cycle and improve life expectancy, the standard of living and all that.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, my personal view is that the intervention programs that are operating aren't targeting kids young enough, and that's Indigenous, non-Indigenous across the board. I just think that we need to have a real look at what those programs are setting out to achieve and what they are actually achieving, because without that sort of base data, we're not going to know whether they're delivering outcomes or not. So I don't think it's a question of whether we need to have different approaches for Indigenous or non-Indigenous kids. I just think we need to look at working with kids who are younger.
And so what are you hoping to see over the next couple of months? We know this petition's going to be presented to State Parliament. The government is doing these tougher bail laws. What do you want to see, or what do you think could be done?
Well, the petition that was started by Phoebe in Tamworth, that has now reached 20,000 signatures. So that will now be required to be debated on the floor in Parliament. And so I'm hopeful that will happen either in March or April. Kevin Anderson, the member for Tamworth, will formally present that petition. And what that does, Daniel, is that it essentially brings this issue to the fore, and the government will now be forced to debate it. In addition to that, I suspect that the government will be bringing in some form of reforms in either the March or April sittings themselves. My approach to this issue is to work with the government as much as possible, because the reality is the government has the numbers, and getting legislation from a bill into an act requires the numbers of Parliament. And so I've been doing whatever I can to work with the government and provide them with as much information about what's happening on the ground in our patch as possible. And so I'm quietly confident that there will be some amendments to be brought forward by the government in the legislative space. But I would also really love to see a targeted approach to get some accountability with all of this funding. I think that's the next step that we need to look at. And that's a difficult conversation, but I think the Parliament should have it.
We'll certainly keep an eye out when Parliament resumes. Brendan Moylan, thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thanks, Daniel.
Now, despite abortion being decriminalised in New South Wales since 2019, many women cannot readily access the healthcare they need, especially in regional areas of the state. It means a woman has to travel hundreds of kilometres to seek an abortion. Recently, a bill was introduced by Greens Upper House member Dr. Amanda Cohn, who seeks to fill the so-called abortion deserts. I spoke to her from New South Wales Parliament in Sydney. Well, Dr. Cohn, thank you so much for joining us. You have been in the limelight quite recently because you've highlighted a very serious issue that has developed across many parts of regional New South Wales, especially areas like the New England Northwest, about abortion deserts. And we know sometimes when people are discussing abortion healthcare or anything like that, it can be a very touchy subject depending on your perspectives. At the moment, what is first the current abortion laws in New South Wales?
So abortion was decriminalised in New South Wales in 2019, 5 years ago. A lot of people are surprised that that was so recent. So it's legislated as a health procedure, as it should be. But since 2019, there hasn't actually been a lot of work to make sure that services are actually available. And while abortion was still in the Crimes Act, I lived down in Albury-Wodonga and I was working as a GP just across the border in Victoria, providing holistic reproductive health care that includes abortion. And we were seeing people travelling hundreds of kilometres across Western New South Wales, coming across into Victoria to access abortion. 5 years later, the law has changed. Abortion is legal in New South Wales, but it's still too hard to access, and we're still seeing people having to travel hundreds of kilometres or pay hundreds or even thousands of dollars out of pocket to access something that can and should be provided in their own community.
And you know, of course, that out here in the New England Northwest, we have some of the most remote communities in the state, and some places it's even a lot closer to get procedures done in another state completely. If you're further around like Inverell, Moree, you've got a better chance of going to Brisbane instead of going to Sydney. And sometimes you would expect maybe to get a procedure if necessary or chosen in at least one of our major regional hospitals, but we don't necessarily have that. What's the situation that we've got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the Hunter, New England, many people are having to travel quite a long way, away from their regular doctor, away from their support networks and their family and friends, at a time that can be quite difficult, needing time off work. This is relatively straightforward healthcare. The medical abortion tablet that can be prescribed up to 9 weeks should be available in small communities from the local GP. Surgical abortion in the first trimester is something that most regional base hospitals have the technical capability and the staffing to do. And so people shouldn't be having to travel this far.
And can you explain the difference between a medical and a surgical abortion?
No problem. A medical abortion is essentially an induced miscarriage from the prescription of medication, and that's currently legal in Australia up to 9 weeks of a pregnancy. It can be very safely provided by GPs. It can be very safely provided in rural areas, and the TGA actually allows endorsed midwives and nurse practitioners to prescribe that medication too, and that's what's happening in Queensland and the ACT, and it's what I think should be happening here in New South Wales to get that access closer to home. A surgical abortion is a minor medical procedure, depending on how far progressed a pregnancy is. So in the first trimester, it's essentially the same as a procedure called a D&C, or the treatment you'd have after a miscarriage. It does get more complicated later in pregnancy, but we know that the vast majority of abortion happens in that first trimester, and it's those procedures where the rural-based hospitals actually already have the staffing, already have the technical capability to provide this care. They really should be providing that in the country.
I find it very difficult to understand what the reasoning is for any state government of New South Wales not to provide the resources, staff and personnel and the information out there. Ever since abortion was decriminalised in 2019, we're now in 2025. You would have thought that by now, even with that legislation being in place as a framework, there would have been all those procedures ready for the local health districts to make the access to abortion healthcare readily available. But it looks like they just seem to have completely either not bothered or just don't understand what the repercussions were.
Yeah, and that law change in 2019 just wasn't followed up with the actual funding for provision of services. Most people expect that most public hospitals would provide abortion care. There's been really good representative polling of residents of New South Wales. 68% of residents of New South Wales think that public hospitals should be providing abortion care. And it's also too hard to even find out information from where to go. I've heard from so many people that they've had to ring around to actually find out information about where to go. Whereas in states like Victoria, there's a really fantastic service called 1-800 My Options, which is both a telephone number and a website that provides really clear information about what services are provided where. And for something like abortion that's really time sensitive, it gets more complicated the further along a pregnancy is. It's actually really important that people can not just get that care closer to home, but easily access information about what's available and where they need to go.
And you also mentioned, of course, the cost. Even to get a medical abortion, that can still cost hundreds of dollars for the medication, as well as the travel time, and also the mental and physical distress that a woman would be placed into, because she is going to make a choice that she knows is very difficult for herself.
Look, it's a deeply personal decision, and I think the role of the health system is really to support people to exercise that choice as safely as possible, as close to home and as reasonably possible. And ideally, that involves people's regular health professionals. For people who are lucky enough to be able to see a GP that they know and trust, that's the best place to be accessing this kind of care.
And Dr. Cohn, have you faced threats or intimidation because you have been in the health system where of course you are pro-choice, but you've also, as a doctor, been assisting women with abortions? Because we know how politically motivated and sensitive this whole thing is, but for the doctors themselves, we've seen, of course, tragically, some people being threatened or hurt physically or even murdered.
Before 2019, there was a significant problem in New South Wales, including Albury, where anti-abortion activists would protest outside of clinics and actually intimidate and harass patients and staff. Since 2019, we've got safe access zones around reproductive health clinics in New South Wales, so that doesn't happen anymore. There are people protesting about this issue on a regular basis outside Parliament in Sydney, and that's the right place for people to express those political views. And I'm really grateful that they're now protesting to politicians rather than the health workers and the patients who deserve privacy.
Now, with the bill that you've introduced last month, what is the main priority for that, and how far has it progressed in state parliament?
So I've tabled my bill in the upper house of the state parliament, and hopefully it will be debated in the coming weeks and coming months. The two most significant changes that the bill proposes are placing a duty on the health minister and the Secretary of New South Wales Health to actually make sure that abortion is accessible throughout the state a reasonable distance from where people live. And also allowing endorsed midwives and nurse practitioners to prescribe the medical abortion tablet, which, as I've explained, it's legal in Australia up to 9 weeks gestation. The TGA allows endorsed midwives and nurse practitioners to prescribe it, but in New South Wales, it's still limited to only doctors. So making that expansion will really improve access, particularly in rural and remote communities. The bill also proposes to remove, there's some really onerous, bureaucratic, mandatory reporting requirements about abortion that are just really unnecessary. And it also proposes that for health professionals who have a conscientious objection, who choose not to provide abortion, I think that's an important right for those individuals, but the bill proposes a requirement that they actually refer someone on to be able to access that care elsewhere, rather than sending patients back to the drawing board to have to work out where to go themselves.
And what's been the response so far from your fellow parliamentarians as well as the general public?
When I talk to members of the general public about this, many people are shocked that this isn't already the case. People reasonably expect that you can access abortion in a regional public hospital, and they're shocked to find out it's not already happening. And there was some really impressive investigative journalism last year that found that only 3 out of the 220 public hospitals in New South Wales are consistently providing abortion and making it publicly known that they provide abortion. People are shocked to hear that, and they think that it's already happening. So there really is a lot of support for change. Particularly, there were some really heart-wrenching stories in the media last year from people who were turned away from public hospitals in Orange and Queanbeyan, which has really provided a lot of momentum for change. I think also when you look at what's happened in the United States and closer to home in Queensland and South Australia, where there is a real push to actually take reproductive rights backwards, it's a really important time to actually embed access to reproductive health care in the public health system and actually strengthen our laws so that this can't be turned backwards in New South Wales.
And just briefly, Dr. Cohn, I know you also had a lot of concerns regarding the state of the New South Wales health system, particularly the big staff shortages we've had in regional and rural areas. We've had the nurses' strikes that's happened last year. We know that several hospitals have been on bypass. We have Tamworth Hospital at 40% occupancy rate. Weewar Hospital isn't operating 24/7. And this situation to try and get more staff, specialists, GPs to these regional areas has been very difficult because many people have been reluctant to come up to these areas. And as it's been stated, the New South Wales nurses are some of the lowest paid nurses in the country at the moment. How are you finding the health?
The New South Wales government absolutely needs to pay nurses, midwives and public hospital doctors at least what they earn in other states. This is really straightforward, especially in communities like New England Northwest that are quite close to the Queensland border, like my own community of Albury, which is close to the Victorian border. Why would health professionals continue to work in the public system in New South Wales when they can make 20 or 30% more across the border? So for nurses, they make 18% more in Queensland. For a psychiatrist, they can make 30% more in other states. The Nurses and Midwives Association have been campaigning on this issue for a long time, and the government just hasn't come to the table to offer them a meaningful pay rise. We're going to continue to see these kinds of staff shortages until the state government actually just pays healthcare workers what they deserve. And, you know, for those issues you've raised, like maternity services at Tamworth, like Wee Waa Hospital, to actually get staff working in these areas in the public system, we have to pay them what they're worth.
Greens Upper House member Dr. Amanda Cohn speaking to me earlier. And that is Firstline for now. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a safe weekend and I'll see you soon. Good night.